Okay. Achtung. So, good evening. Welcome to those who are here in person. Welcome to those joining us live online. Welcome to people who are joining us on the video archive. We have two videos to show tonight. One that we tried to broadcast last week but couldn't because our internet was down, and then the video that was regularly scheduled for tonight. So you're in for a treat. I'll try to talk less, we watch more, and maybe by doing that, we'll learn more and may even have some more fun. We're going to watch the first video, then I'll maybe just reflect on it for a couple of minutes, because many of us were in the class for this last week. And then I'll start the second video, following which there should be still plenty of time left for questions and answers. So Carl, would you please play video number 2?
Sound on site.
Welcome back. In the last session, we met the first Lutheran immigrants to the New World. Dutch Lutherans in New Amsterdam, later called New York, Swedes, Austrian Salzburgers in the south, and Germans led by Henry Muhlenberg. The Danes colonized the Caribbean, creating churches on St. Croix and St. Thomas, and opening their doors to local inhabitants, Africans, Hispanics, Native Americans. This colonial period sees the first wave of immigration. In this session, we'll look at the next wave.
The second wave of Lutherans comes between about 1840 and 1920 with the great immigration that brought somewhere on the order of 35 million immigrants to the United States in that 80-year period of time. And they're coming from Germany, first of all, and then from Scandinavia, and then later on from places like Finland and Eastern Europe, Slovakia, other sorts of places like that.
And because they're coming when they're coming, they go farther west, more into Ohio, and then Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas a little bit, Dakotas. So that's a second wave. And these people, they immediately form lots of extra local church bodies or adjudicators or whatever you want to call them. So the Swedes formed the Augustana Synod. Interestingly, Swedes have the same kinds of debates, but they don't all demand that they stay Lutheran, right? So you get Swedish Baptists, Swedish Methodists, Swedish blah, blah, other things. Whereas the Norwegians all assert that they're Lutherans. So you get many kinds of Norwegian Lutherans, from the Hauge Synod to the Norwegian Synod being the closest to the state church.
You know, this is the huge bulge of Lutheran immigrants coming in this period of time. And of course, it completely overwhelms the Lutherans who had been here for 150, 200 years. And of course, all these new immigrants are speaking languages other than English. So they're going to have to go through the same thing all over again, figuring out what America is all about and how they're going to structure their religion in this new pluralistic, voluntary religious world.
These newly arriving Lutherans are largely pietists. This factor significantly shapes how the Lutheran Church looks in America.
Pietism is such a wonderful movement to study, and it's so important for American Lutherans because pietism is portable. You can't take bells with you, and you can't take steeples, and you can't take cathedrals, and you can't take universities. You can't take libraries. You can't take the whole apparatus of a state church, a Landeskirche. You can't take that, but pietism you can take with you.
For some people in our present time, pietism has become a negative term that connotes a self-righteous attitude smacking of judgmentalism. But that's a modern stereotype of pietism. The Lutheran pietists during this time are better prepared to plant the faith in this new land than Lutherans from state churches. Pietism is a movement that emphasizes personal experience of God's love and consistent Christian living.
Now, pietism has had many different developments. It's got missionary movements that have come out of it. It really empowers lay people. It's got a threatening aspect to it because of that. It really especially pressed for moral changes in everyday life. It took aim against card playing, the Masons, dancing, drinking, all of the, because a pious life would not indulge in those kinds of things. And at the same time as they're doing that, they're really taking aim at the kind of upper class lifestyle. So it is a movement of humble people that are finding their voice. You could see that that's a kind of movement that's going to be very sustainable in an immigrant situation.
The pietists tended to be the people who would go off and do missions. And remember, America was a mission. So a lot of the clergy that we got were not the state church pastors. Somebody like Muhlenberg, who, for example, who was a pietist. He came to America because it was a mission field. Pietism, in this sense, is a movement that's pushing towards both a spiritual renewal of people, but also an understanding of the role of the law in people's lives. In other words, that being a Christian means that you live your life differently, morally. There are always the stereotypes of pietism, and some pietists fit the stereotypes. But most overall, most of American Lutheranism, as it develops in the 18th and 19th century, develops out of pietism. It tends to be less formal. So pastors not wearing all the fancy gowns and the fancy liturgies. What they wanted was the people wanted the pastor to speak from the heart. The pietists had it a lot easier than some of the other Lutherans coming over because they were willing to work with the kinds of structures, the religious structures that America had. The state church pastors, who tended to be more formal, had more trouble dealing with this new American religious world, and so the pietists tended to be a little bit more successful. Now, the great masses of people, some were pietists, some weren't, but much of the denominational structures that were developed in the 19th century were developed by the pietists.
During this time, revivalism is sweeping the land. How do the pietist Lutherans relate to this high-profile, energetic movement?
There's certain aspects of revivalism that most Lutherans didn't go in for. They didn't go in for some of the wilder stuff and the faith healing and other kinds of things like that. But that whole business of spiritual awakening that you get from pietism, they found kindred spirits in the revivalists.
As time moves on, this church seeks to become more American. And into this new age, new leaders arise.
The Lutherans who had been here since colonial times, by the 1830s, 1840s, they themselves had become thoroughly acclimatized to America. They spoke English. They tended to pick up some of the religious elements of their neighbors, those sorts of things like that. And the leading person in this sort of Americanized East Coast Lutheranism was a man named Samuel Simon Schmucker. And he was sort of the leading light, sort of the next great figure beyond Muhlenberg. And he's coming to prominence in the 1830s and 1840s, just as this massive immigration of people from Europe is coming. They're not sure what to make of these Americanized Lutherans who speak English and aren't Lutheran the way they think they should be Lutheran. What you're going to get is a theological fight over what does it mean to be Lutheran. You know, do you have to speak German to be Lutheran? How closely do you have to follow the Lutheran confessions? Schmucker allowed for a little bit more leniency, for example, on traditional Lutheran teaching than perhaps others did.
And so he looks at the Augsburg Confession and he says there are mistakes in it. Baptismal regeneration, whoops. The not keeping the Puritan Sabbath, and 3 others. Right? So he finds these mistakes. He helps found Gettysburg College, Gettysburg Seminary. So you see that movement toward self-propagation. Right. So also going from a mission field to a church. That story is here too.
Samuel Simon Schmucker attempts to lead the Evangelical Lutheran General Synod of the United States toward unification with other American Protestants. He holds to a symbolic view of Christ's presence in the Lord's Supper, a reformed position. Schmucker tries to get the Synod to reject the Augsburg Confession in favor of his compromising, definite platform. It does not go as he planned. Isaac Newton's third law of motion tells us that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Well, Schmucker's effort to push Lutherans away from their core beliefs results in a massive pendulum swing in the opposite direction. Instead of creating a more ecumenical movement, Schmucker's failed attempt helps ignite a neo-Lutheran revival, prompting the formation of the General Council, led by Charles Porterfield Krauth. Their alternative approach is based on Lutheran pulpits are for Lutheran ministers only, and Lutheran altars are for Lutheran communicants only.
And of course, when some of these Lutherans came over, especially the people who founded the Missouri Synod, a man named C.F.W. Walter, he takes one look at these American Lutherans and says, I want nothing to do with them. And so all of a sudden now you're starting to have polls and different types of Lutheran. It was linguistic, but it was more than linguistic. It was also theological. They're going to have to fight that one out. And then, of course, all the other people come in the middle between the Americanized Lutherans on the East Coast and the very conservative German Midwesterners on the other hand. And that's the Swedes will come in, the Norwegians will come in, the Danes, the Finns, more Germans. And of course, they all can't be in the same group with each other.
It might seem odd from our modern perspective that rather than join existing Lutheran churches, these new immigrants form their own denominations.
Lutherans called their churches, their national denominations, a number of different sorts of things. Sometimes they called them synods, sometimes they called them churches. And so, and then you'd have this strange phenomena, for example, with the Missouri Synod. It does start out as a regional synod in Missouri.
These new groups, although separate, share many things in common.
They have different languages. They have the commonality of the confessions, but with slightly different emphases. So the Scandinavians have the Augsburg Confession and the Small Catechism, but not the whole blasted thing like the Saxons. So at one point in the late 19th century, there are something like 65 different extra-local church bodies.
For all their internecine squabbles, American Lutherans share a missionary zeal. And so there is another modest attempt at ministry among Blacks and Indians.
While there had been mission efforts in the United States among those who were already here, to both Blacks and Indians, the only really concentrated effort took place with the Hartford College experiment, which was primarily designed for the education of Black and Red heathen.
The great moral question of the day is slavery, and it's dividing the nation and the churches. How do Lutherans address this divisive conundrum?
It was a major controversy among Lutherans, especially since we had a whole group of Lutherans in the South who had been there for several hundred years and had become acclimatized to slavery. And then we had a number of Lutherans, for example, in the border states, such as Missouri and other sorts of places like this, where even talking about abolition was a major problem. There were small synods that were rabid abolitionists. There were synods who were, like in the South, who were all for slavery. And then there were the ones in the Midwest that sort of struggled with how to understand how to deal with this.
I think an important narrative to think about are two different places. One is St. Louis, Missouri. in the 1850s, and the other is Galesburg, Illinois, in the 1850s. And there's a Swedish Lutheran minister just beginning. He is very interested in the freedom movements, very much anti-slavery. His name is Tuvin Nilsson Hasselquist. He's on the platform during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, a fervent Republican, broadcasting this in the very first Swedish-American newspaper that was published. And it was for immigrants in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa. It also went to New York. It went across the country. So this was a very public debate, national debate among Swedish Americans. But in the same 50s, we have John Brown's raids in Kansas, Missouri, and the Bleeding Kansas. So John Brown stages one of his big raids, and there are abolitionists that are killing property owners. So right after one of these raids, CFW Walther issues a publication that has a little excerpt about slavery in it, and he quotes directly from Luther's rant against the peasants' revolt, against the robbing, thieving hordes of peasants. And it comes down squarely in a camp of, we wouldn't call it pro-slavery, but it was certainly anti-abolitionist, because these are the same as the peasants that had revolted in 1525. So we have these two Lutheran leaders squaring off. They're not talking to each other, but they're really reflecting their own arguments in a very public way in their newspaper to their people. So happens that the new-come Norwegian settlers didn't have the means to educate their own ministers, so they're educating them in St. Louis with a Norwegian theological professor there who is taking the line of Missouri that is against abolition. Now, that's a very interesting reality that already in the 1850s, we have these divergent views of the proper social order that God has designed for us. Right after Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, we get a 4-part series in the Missouri paper about what does the Bible say about slavery. And it's long. It's written by pastor in Fort Wayne about why the Bible allows for slavery and how God has designed this order, and who are we to mess with scripture translations, etc. Now, the Norwegians are meeting up in Decorah. The war has been declared. There are all these Union soldiers in the congregations, and they come to their synod meeting and they say, we can't take it anymore, getting these pastors out of Concordia, St. Louis, who don't agree with what our positions are. So there's this big debate in the Norwegian churches about what are we going to do about that? Well, maybe we need our own school. This is sort of the birth of Luther College.
Pastor John Bachman, a friend and co-author of famed naturalist J.J. Audubon, is an example of the complicated Lutheran response to slavery in the South.
There's also the Southern Lutheran view. John Bachman, who is the founding pastor and professor at Southern Seminary, wrote and delivered the prayer at the secession of the South Carolinian state legislature from the United States.
John Bachman went to South Carolina to be pastor of St. John's, the church that Muhlenberg helped to get started. Within 3 or 4 years of his arrival, he had a Sunday school of about 20 blacks. 1830, he had a Sunday school of 200 blacks. In 1862, 1/4 of all Lutherans in South Carolina were black by census. In 1962, there were no blacks on the rosters of Lutheran churches 100 years later. So in one sense, the Civil War and its aftermath changed the nature of the Southern Church. Bachman was instrumental in all of that. One is, he sent 3 people to be ordained. Yehu Jones went to the ministerium to be ordained as a Lutheran, to be sent to Africa as a missionary. That didn't take place. He started St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Philadelphia. Daniel Payne was a teacher of a school in Charleston, South Carolina that had both black and white students. The South Carolina legislature put through a law which banned any black from teaching and owning a school.
And that was his livelihood, so he had to leave. And he was a Methodist. And the Methodists said, well, we'll educate you as long as you promise to go to Liberia as a missionary. And this Daniel Alexander Payne said, I really don't feel called to go to Liberia. The students at Gettysburg Seminary had a Society of Inquiry on Mission, and they raised the money to fund his education at Gettysburg Seminary. So he came up to Gettysburg Seminary.
At Gettysburg, he then found himself in the anti-slavery movement and preaching about it, teaching about it, and then ultimately being ordained to the Francian Lutheran Synod, which was the only synod to talk against slavery prior to the Civil War. The third was Boston J. Drayton, and we're talking about a period between 1832 and about 1837. 1837, Boston J. Drayton was ordained in Charleston, South Carolina. I think Bachman figured out that sending him off to the north was not working. So he ordained him in Charleston, South Carolina, sent him directly to Maryland, which was a neighboring state at that point to what Liberia was going to become. And by his death, he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Liberia. So here is a man who was heavily invested in seeing something be done in Africa, but at the same time, he then became the president of the Synod of the South and started Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary.
The years of this second wave of immigration are challenging times. Faith as practiced in the old country was kind of a monoculture. This new land contains a rich diversity of beliefs, ethnicities, languages, and customs. Adapting to these new circumstances requires a lively mind and a trusting spirit. Brutal conditions meet these newcomers who seek to make a new life here. Harsh winters and terrible epidemics take their toll. Their faith is an anchor in changing times. And letting go of so much of what they know and love tests their trust in God. They also confront an enormous moral question in the institution of slavery. This means that they'll have to read the Bible in a new way to discover God's will for the world. It won't be an easy road. In the next session, we will see how Lutherans define themselves in these new circumstances and how they find common ground with other Lutherans, or not. We'll see you next time. Thanks.
Okay, so while Carol pauses video number 2, what I'm going to suggest we do now, can everyone online hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. What I suggest we do now is simply move straight into video number 3, the video number 2 for tonight. Those of you who were not here last week, if you have any questions based on the video we've just seen, scribble it down. Whatever Q&A time we have tonight, we can address those questions and questions coming out of the next video. If there's not enough time to address all the questions, then God forbid next week we won't start with so much palaver as this week, and there'll be one video next week and plenty of time to talk. Okay, so Carl, I just ask you to run the next video, please.
Patrick,
Oh, hold on a second. Wait, Carl, sorry.
sometimes the music was a little loud. Do we need that music?
There's no way to disengage the music from the video. It comes with the video. I understand. Believe me, I've seen videos like this even worse than that. But we can't. I get it though. I completely get it.
Hello, and welcome back. In our last session, we saw how the Lutherans who arrived in the second great wave of immigration established countless Lutheran congregations and what seems like almost as many denominations. They come face to face with the evils of slavery. They argue about Lutheran doctrine and practices, and they attempt to make new lives in an often hostile environment. And then the American Civil War. In one sense, it's not really a particularly Lutheran story. Virtually all Americans are affected by it, swept up in it. But in another sense, it is the culmination of all the anxiety and vitriol on both sides of the issue of slavery. This includes Lutherans, who are increasingly polarized between North and South by this issue. When the South secedes and war erupts, Lutherans are on the front lines on both sides. Countless Lutherans throw themselves into battlefield support as chaplains, deaconesses, and nurses. Students at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis form their own company of soldiers to defend their beloved campus. When the Confederate Army pushes north into Pennsylvania, the pivotal Battle of Gettysburg literally takes place on the grounds of the oldest Lutheran seminary in the United States. And when the war shifts into the Union's favor, Lutherans in the Carolinas and Deep South are displaced as armies confiscate and destroy goods and property in their path. After the war, Lutheran colleges and seminaries in the South collapse without students and revenue. Lutherans remain divided between North and South for the next 50 years. So perhaps the Civil War is a Lutheran story after all. But let's get back to our main story. In this session, we will see how immigrant Lutherans try to adapt to the American landscape while still holding on to their traditions and language.
Through about the 19th century, we spent most of our time building more and more different Lutheran denominations. And there were reasons, there were theological reasons, there were cultural reasons, I mean, especially linguistic reasons for separate synods.
The pattern of Lutheran life in America is really closely related to issues of immigration, and that's a very complex issue. First of all, if you think about places that have historically been Lutheran, Germany, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, as immigrants from those countries came to this country, well, of course, they don't all form the same church because they don't all speak the same language. And so from the beginning, one of the kinds of diversity we have is this diversity of ethnicity and language. Well, now let's add the question of geography. Early immigrants come, settle on the East Coast. Later waves of immigrants come up the Mississippi River, settling in the Midwest, or taking rail or boat through the Great Lakes to get to the Midwest. And so you may have plenty of immigrants from the same place in the old country who are in vastly different places in the New World.
Many Lutherans name their new denominations after their home country. Others name them after the state in which they settle.
If you come across the name of a synod that is named for a state, good bet that it's Germans. The Missouri Synod, Germans. The Iowa Synod, Germans. The Michigan Synod, Germans. The Buffalo Synod, Germans. Okay, they all speak German, but when you're talking about the 19th century, certainly the Germans in Buffalo, New York, and the Germans in Iowa, and the Germans in Minnesota aren't all going to be part of the same national body. We don't have the transportation and the communication to make that feasible. So that issue of geography, where people actually are, is another reason that we end up with different church bodies. Another issue actually has to do with what we might call a theological orientation or a question of piety. Back in the old country, we know that the pietist movement was very important. We also know that in some churches, pietism was really considered a threat by the established church. And so you have two camps, if you will, orthodoxy, insisting that religion is largely about right doctrine, and certainly insisting on formal liturgy, a university-trained clergy. And then you have pietism, which tended to emphasize the involvement of lay people, tended to emphasize living the faith, not just believing the right things. This is an oversimplification, but some people like to say, well, orthodoxy is the religion of the head, pietism is the religion of the heart. And so if in Norway or in Germany or in Denmark, you have an Orthodox and a Pietist strand. Those folks who come to the United States are going to reflect those things too. And so you may have people who speak the same language and who settle in the same territory, but whose approach to what it means to live out a Lutheran life is different. And it takes a while for them to overcome those differences as well. Now, one of the other factors is really the factor of time. Immigration and assimilation go together. Eventually, immigrant groups figure out how to become part of the larger society, but that takes time. And so if you look at the Lutherans who settled on the Eastern Seaboard, many of whom were there already in the 1700s, they've been through these issues of language and assimilation. They had come to peace with what it meant to be Lutheran in America. There were some vigorous debates about what it meant to be Lutheran in America, but over time, you find a way.
Amidst such overwhelming change, most anyone would feel grief and loss, surrendering cultural identity, heritage, traditions. So it's not surprising that many of these ethnic groups cling to their native tongues for worship and preaching.
You can look back and say, well, of course, immigration would come to an end. Well, they didn't know that. They needed to keep having the foreign language denomination because they were expecting to get more immigrants. They didn't know that immigration would somehow stop or be cut off or both. But once that immigration stops, and it stops right around World War I for a number of different reasons, and does not resume, they're all very quickly making the transition to English. Now, all of a sudden, the reason for separate denominations doesn't seem to be as clear. Old fights tend to be papered over or negotiated away. And there's a new generation of younger Lutherans who are saying, well, we really need to be one. We need to be moving towards greater and greater unity. We spent most of the 20th century moving from dozens of Lutheran denominations to at the point at which we've got now 2 major ones and 3 or 4 smaller ones. That basically took most of the 20th century to do.
As these Lutherans settle in, they begin to find some common ground with other Lutherans. But of course, like any relationship, it's not easy, smooth, or without regular disagreement.
It's nice to talk about how Lutherans over time overcame some of the barriers and some of the differences between them. But of course, that's too simple a story, because at almost every turn, as groups came together, there was another small group that broke off or that didn't join in the larger flow. And so we still have a number of Lutheran denominations in the country today.
There are lots of different factors that Lutherans fight over. The main ones tend to be theological, questions of biblical authority, the authority of the Lutheran confessions. For example, how much unity does there have to be before there is informal relationships between these various denominations? But all of these, of course, have secondary issues, and I call this the Pastor Johnson hypothesis. Real Lutheranism is what Pastor Johnson did in my home church when I was growing up, and they're fighting over what does it mean really to be Lutheran in this very pluralistic world.
These churches are now functioning without government support. For Lutherans from Europe, this is new territory, and they discover a great deal of unmet human need.
Almost all of these bodies also found institutions for, I call them works of love. So we have means of grace, the sacraments, and then we have works of love. And those are hospitals and orphanages and old people's homes and all those kinds of things, along with educational institutions, which aren't exactly works of love, but in my category that way I put them. So you can, the reason I bring that up at this point is most of these have been founded by the early 20th century. So if we went in 1920 and plotted out all those schools, we would be able to say, oh, look, there's one in Des Moines and there's one in Blair, Nebraska. And the one in Des Moines is what was called the Happy Danes. And the one that was in Blair, Nebraska is what was called the Holy or Sad Danes. So even the little Danish group becomes two different groups.
You have to remember the 19th century was this time of just an explosion of educational and other sorts of voluntary benevolent institutions. I mean, this was the genius of American Christianity, where it was all of these colleges and all of these hospitals and orphanages and everything else. It wasn't done by the state, it was done by groups of people who were interested in doing it.
Midwestern schools, they get started at the time of the immigrant communities who need their own places and their own schools, and they're going to teach in their own languages. These were sustaining organizations that helped to perpetuate the strength of the community.
William Alfred Passavant, a Lutheran pastor from Pennsylvania and an ardent abolitionist, brings the deaconess movement to the United States. He brings his Protestant deaconesses to work with Dorothea Dix in Civil War hospitals, treating the wounded, both those in blue and those in gray. He helps create many social ministry organizations that still serve today. These and hundreds of other social ministry organizations formed over the years today constitute the largest nonprofit organization in the country. It's called Lutheran Services in America.
When you read about the deaconesses, they have this sense that you don't need to check out people's theology before you take their temperature and bandage their wounds, right? And so that's one of the places where the expansion of understanding of neighbor grows first.
We want to give and serve our neighbor. We want to be the kind of people that help our neighbor to be strong and vital, because we want our neighbor to be a partner. We don't want our neighbor always to be dependent on us. So, I mean, there's these very important aspects of what we've learned as Americans, that we need to help each other. That's true about Lutheran theology. That's one of the key parts about Lutheran theology, that the church is not the church unless it's helping its neighbor, unless there's a diaconal dimension to it.
After the Civil War, Lutherans once again attempt to reach out to Black Americans.
By 1872, the Missouri Synod decided that they needed to have a formalized work especially among Black folks in the South. And they developed an organization called the Synodical Conference. John Detcher was the first missionary to work in the Synodical Conference. His first year, he literally started congregations almost like one every 3 weeks. But they weren't necessarily congregations. He started missionary efforts that talked about education among Blacks. He developed schools. And so the Missouri Synod school system and then the school church connection was one that was born out of that effort.
Lutherans also attempt to minister once again to American Indians.
But it was then in the 1890s where ministries started taking hold that are still extant today. One of those is the Oaks, Oklahoma mission. That actually was started by the Moravians. The Moravians were working with the Cherokee in Georgia at the time of the Trail of Tears. And so when the Cherokee were removed and brought to Oklahoma and started what is now Ebenezer Lutheran Church and Oaks Indian Mission. Another one is actually in Wisconsin, the Stockbridge Indians, who came from Massachusetts, that kind of the same trip that my tribe did to Wisconsin.
By this time, most Lutherans are finally adapting to life in the United States. And one thing is for certain, the Lutheran Church in this country does not look like its European counterparts.
A story of American Lutheranism that also works is how we respond to the new circumstances, including voluntarism, separation of church and state. These are related and key factors in American religious history. The separation of church and state means the church has to be self-supporting. One of the principles on the mission field, right? So the mission field becomes a church when the church is self-propagating, self-governing, and self-supporting. Lutherans in the United States have to figure out how to do that. They came here not for religious freedom, usually not because they were being persecuted, but they also, with a few exceptions, didn't come with the idea of being church and without getting much support from their home church, because that was the state church, and the state church wasn't going to take care of them in a different state.
The strategy for obtaining trained pastors during this period usually involves importing them from the old country.
The more high church, the more state church people kind of thought it as a temporary thing. You know, you would go to Wisconsin and have a parsonage made out of logs for a few years and then go home to the real work. It wasn't regarded as a plum.
It eventually becomes clear that American Lutherans are better off training their own pastors here, because those they bring over from Europe are not well prepared for the realities of American life.
And they had to figure out, what do we do to be self-propagating? How do we get leaders? How do we get clergy who will administer the sacraments and preach the gospel, but who know how to do it here in these circumstances? So separation of church and state, and then voluntarism. How do we pay for this? And how do we maintain our membership? They weren't even really worried very much about evangelism, just to keep what they had, right? So those stories go to the very beginning, The Church of New Sweden didn't really work out. You know, they really pretty much were absorbed into the Church of England Anglican churches. So when you go to Gloria Dei and Old Swedes in Philadelphia, those are all Episcopal churches now, because that's how it worked out. But because of that, I think one of the stories of American Lutheranism that's really interesting is how you deal with one and many. How do you figure out what's at the center? How do you deal with these kinds of diversity? We haven't thought of it that way. And it's kind of a lost opportunity, but not entirely lost. If we think back, right? If we re-narrate that story, we can say, oh, that's partly what we were learning to do.
One of the key provisions of the U.S. Constitution is the separation of church and state. This means no support of the churches from the government. How did Lutherans view this foundational American principle?
This strong theological decision by the reformers that God has given vocations to all of us. The vocations don't just come to the clergy. So also the princes, the merchants, everyone has a vocation that God is directing. So there isn't any secular world. Everything is God's world. So that means that God is giving direction already. And the only time that churches really should pipe up is if they feel that their own, their responsibility is to preach the gospel. If they see that there's something really terrible happening, then they might, or maybe the secular authorities or the state authorities would say, you can't do this any longer. We're going to close your churches. Then the churches might have to say something. But otherwise, as long as they can follow this. So that there's the foundation thing, which you can interpret it to say, stay out of it, you churches. Now we're here in the United States, and you have democracy. People vote and decide these things. Okay, so how do the congregations and pastors guide the decisions of the people? Whereas the church, it's not the presiding bishop that's the church; it's the people that are the church. And so, how do we articulate that voice? It's going to sound scrambled.
Lutherans who come to this new place seek to be faithful to their traditions and beliefs while adapting to a very different world. They establish institutions to serve human need and build colleges and seminaries to train leaders for service in this new context. In the next session, we will see that after the turn of the 20th century, these groups begin to find some common ground. But, surprise, it's a contentious and messy process. See you next time.
There we go. Okay, and we're back. Oh, that light is bright, isn't it? After 20 minutes in the darkness, it's bright. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left. So as I said before the video started, between the two videos, any unaddressed questions will open with next week. But let's make a start. So you folks at home and you folks in the room, and even Kevin, what jumped out at you at either video, either presentation that made you go, oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Or I'm not sure I agree with that. Or gosh, I wish they'd said a little bit more about that. What jumped out at you? And we do have some pastors on Zoom if they're still awake and still connected, all of us together. And so Bob Stunkel, you jump in at any time if there's something that I can't answer, or it's obvious I'm going around the bush because I don't know what I'm talking about. Bob, absolutely jump in. So online or in the room, either video, what jumped out at you? What do you want to talk about?
It was pretty clear, actually. You did a pretty good job.
Oh, hold on a second. I've got a, so that the people at home can hear you.
I didn't really have a whole lot to say. I just thought they did a pretty good job this week of kind of explaining things. And it just to kind of summarize it, just to make sure I've got it. It looked like when the Lutherans came, they populated by the different countries, and each version of Lutheran was kind of morphed into something that was culturally from their country. They used their language, those kinds of things. And now we're getting to the point where they're almost looking at being one church, but I don't know if they ever really got there, did they?
So did everyone online hear the question?
No.
No. Just reflecting on the diversity, geographical and ethnic, but then over time, the desire to be one and have unity, and did it happen? So yes and no. It sort of happened. The zenith of North American unity comes in 1988. When this denomination is formed, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which was formed by three predecessor bodies. Two of them were enormous: the LCA, the Lutheran Church in America, and the ALC, the American Lutheran Church. They brought vast quantities of Lutherans together. And then a smaller body, the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches, which was a breakaway group, well, a group that was kicked out of Missouri Synod, formed this temporary association, and then said to the two bigger, older bodies, come on, guys, you've been talking about unity for years. Let's come together. And so the Association of Evangelical Lutheran Churches, although smaller, punched beyond their weight and became the catalyst that brought the big merger together. The oomph that brought the merger together. And at that point, there were really three significant Lutheran bodies in America: this new ELCA, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and Wisconsin Synod, both of which were considerably smaller than this new ELCA. Now, over the years, the ELCA has lost members. It's much closer now, but still sizable compared to the Missouri Synod, and Wisconsin remains somewhat small. But at that point, that moment in time, 1988, 1989, 1990, the height of unity, so many millions of Americans in one denomination, and with a single service book and hymnal, the old Green Book, the Lutheran Book of Worship, which was approved by the ALC, the LCA, and Missouri Synod, even though Missouri, as no sooner had they approved it and they started to print their hymnals with their name on it, then they withdrew from using it. But in that brief moment in time, unity and a single worship book. That's the height of unity. Since then, there's been a little bit of fracturing, although I think we've lost more members to death and inactivity than we have to storming off and joining something else. But yes, so the commentator had said most of the 20th century was a time was spent coming together in unity. That's true. Climaxing in 1988 with our formation. Other questions? Yes, Bob, I hear your voice.
In that regard, I'll just add, and one of our videos coming up may include the mid-60s, when the Lutheran Council in the USA, called LaCusa, where Missouri Synod was also really as close in theological conversation, in a number of areas of ministry outreach, publications, and just as you have mentioned, leading also towards the Lutheran Book of Worship.
Yes.
In the latter 60s and early 70s, as that was under preparation.
Yes, and then also branches of Lutherans that reflected the liturgical movement that was sweeping Protestant churches after Vatican II, rediscovering. Well, the Swedes didn't rediscover it; they had it all along. But other Lutherans rediscovering a rich liturgical tradition that had somehow got lost along the way, in part because pietists weren't particularly deeply enamored of liturgy. But in Vatican II, the Catholic Church reassessed its liturgy, and in North America, many of the leading Lutheran liturgical scholars who are still alive but now retired, or in the case of Mark Bangert, recently deceased, Bob Stunkel, you and I would both say of blessed memory. They were the young bucks of the Lutheran liturgical renewal movement, which culminates in the LBW, because the LBW is a much more structured liturgy, much more reflective of the historic liturgy of the church than many of the earlier service book and hymnals were. But yes, Bob, to answer the question you began with, the very next video spends a lot of time, spends some time looking at how it was that those diverse, fractured Lutheran congregations and churches and synods, not how they found unity in answer to the previous question, but found instead ways to work together, almost as if they promised, pinky swear, we're not going to talk theology. Sometimes having to promise each other they wouldn't worship together, because that would just muddy the waters. But you'll see a number of bodies, starting really with World War I, where the fractured Lutheran bodies in North America found for the first time ways to significantly work together, way beyond tokenism, way beyond just, we'll form a Bible study. Not that there's anything tokenist about a Bible study, they're great, but actually forming social service organizations and voluntary organizations. Even then, sometimes, and Bob, you may know better than I, not that you were around during the First World War, don't get me wrong, I'm not casting aspersions, but just that you would remember the time when even coming together like that was done with some sense of uneasiness and some sense of having to tread softly, but in the process being able to do incredible things together. And some time is spent on that next week. That's a good point to raise, Bob. It was starting to be touched on this week with the deaconess movement, but you'll start to see it really flower with the outbreak of World War I. I can't remember when you guys came into World War I. I want to say 1914, but I think us Brits have managed to get in earlier than everyone else each time. So I think you were a year or 2 or 3 after that. Yeah.
Further observation, if I may.
Yes. Oh, Herb, good evening. when I said we had a pastor on, I didn't realize we had two. So Pastor Herb, yes, go for it.
I'm rather disappointed in the fact that the formation of the Lutheran Church in America, which was before the formation of the ELCA, was not covered in this, because the formation of the Lutheran Church in America, in terms of my personal experience, late 50s, early 60s, was in and of itself a major step forward.
Mm-hmm.
Bringing together synods, for example, that had never before worked together.
Now, when was that church formed, Herb?
I'm going to say the early 1960s.
Yeah. Well, we're not there yet in the videos. Video one kind of took us to the end of the Civil War. Video two started to talk about, started to focus more on additional immigration, additional Americanization, just dipping its toes into unification, and really the most, other than fleetingly, really just bringing us almost to World War I. So there's time. So far I've only watched ahead to next week's. I haven't looked at week 6, and there is a week 5, and there is a bonus week 6. So I hope to tell you that that's actually looked at in more depth later. I can't swear to it, but I would assume it would be.
Well, I am remembering a time when, for example, what was called the Ministerium of Pennsylvania, and going back to the first video, that was spoken of as being the first Lutheran body in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
That was Henry Melchior Muhlenberg.
Yes.
I can remember being a part of that synod, and then coming together in Pennsylvania, no less, with something that was called the Central. You heard it earlier in this video, and the second video. It was the Central Pennsylvania Synod, and that was a huge step forward.
Yes.
In fact, if you lived and ministered in Pennsylvania, as I did, it was not uncommon in major cities of Pennsylvania to find Lutheran congregations of competing synods that were then part of the LCA, existing on 3 of the 4 street corners of some of the major intersections of those Pennsylvania cities.
Yes. Happened also in Syracuse. There was a street corner downtown that had 3 German churches, one on each corner. And my quip, I think, a few weeks ago was, boy, they couldn't just fracture one more time and fill both corners. They obviously weren't trying. Must have been lazy Germans. But yes, and I've got friends and colleagues, retired pastors, showing their age, but who've said, don't ever use the word ministerium around me to talk about conferences and synods. Any ministerium pales in comparison with the Pennsylvania ministerium. And so I don't use that M word around them, because they just shake their head and say, you don't know what a ministerium was. And they say it with great sincerity. I hear you, Herb. One last question before we go, but like I said, we will open with time to talk a little more next week. I'm just very pleased we've caught up a bit.
Stupid new guy question. Is there a body in charge of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America? Like, obviously you got the Pope for the Catholics, you got the Archbishop of Canada, the England.
Yeah.
Is there, who's... So
the question, I suspect the question wasn't picked up by the mic. So the question was, how is the ELCA organized? What was that wise American who said, I don't belong to any organized political party. I'm a Democrat. Will Rogers, yeah. So, to assume that there's organization in the ELCA, it might be overstretching things. There is. We are formed in a sort of tripartite manner. So our founding documents talk about the three expressions of the church: congregation, synod, and church-wide. Congregation is organized despite appearances to the contrary. We're organized and structured with a constitution and a church council and elections and explicit details of how to call a pastor and all that kind of stuff. But the pastor and the congregation council, in concert with the president of the congregation, tend to run things. Then there's a synod, which is the coming together of groups of congregations, either because of the state, we're the Florida Bahamas Synod, so every ELCA congregation in Florida and the Bahamas are in our synod. But Illinois has a lot of Lutherans, so there's North Illinois Synod, Southern, Central, and Metro Chicago Synod. In New York, there's Metro New York and Upstate New York. And when you start to get the Synod of the Southeast, or of New England, or the Rocky Mountain Synod, they can be multiple states all coming together to form a synod. Basically depends on how many Lutherans are there around there. And so those synods are overseen by a bishop and assistants to the bishop and staff in the bishop's office, and then truly overseen by a synod assembly, which is the equivalent of our congregational meeting coming together. And there's a constitution that guides that and explains how bishops are elected and how many years is in a term and how many terms they can be elected for. And then we have, so that's congregation and that's synod. And then we have church-wide, headquartered in Chicago, a stone's throw from O'Hare on Higgins Road. If you happen to have stayed overnight at a hotel near O'Hare, they're almost all on Higgins Road. And eventually you see a big office building that's Church House. That's the ELCA. We own the whole building and just have a floor or two in it. And we have a presiding bishop and a church council, like there's a synod council and like there's a congregation council. So everything, all of the structure that a congregation has is reflected at the synod and the national level, just with a slight tweak in terms: congregation council, synod council, church council, pastor, bishop, presiding bishop, and then, you know, the bureaucracies that are involved. So yeah, we have that church-wide expression is the coming together of the whole of the ELCA in the United States. Good question. And I've got handouts that explain that a little better. Okay, we're going to call it quits for tonight. I want to thank you for your patience with the gremlins that tripped us up at the start. For those who had to sit through that video twice now, I still hope it was entertaining and you were able to draw something from it. And for those of you for whom both videos tonight were brand new, I hope you thoroughly enjoyed it. And I will see you here next week, same time, same bat channel, and we'll watch video 4 and talk about tonight also. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I thought I switched it on and didn't.
I got you.
So you can stop the recording.
Yes, sir. Well, and thank you, Pastor Ken, and for all the persistence.
Oh, you're very welcome, Pastor. Take care all.